There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like a hell breath, like something enormous pressing down on the air around it. Not threatening, exactly, but weighted. The kind of silence that makes you lower your own voice without knowing why you did it. That's what standing near the horse guards was like that morning. Not Buckingham. People always assume Buckingham. But it was Horse Guards Parade, Whitehall, technically, with a mounted sentry stand in their alcoves like something carved out of another century and left there to confuse the present one. I'd walked past that building probably a dozen times on various London trips. Never stopped. Always had somewhere to be, some itinerary printed off and folded into my jacket pocket, some museum or gallery pulling me forward. That Tuesday, I had nowhere to be. My flight had been delayed by 11 hours. Not canceled, delayed, which is somehow worse, because canceled gives you permission to unravel entirely, find a hotel, order room service, accept your defeat with dignity. Delayed just means you wait. You sit in airport limbo, or you wander the city with your luggage in a left luggage locker, and your whole body in a kind of suspended, foggy purgatory. So I wandered. It was October, mid-morning, the sky doing that particular London thing where it can't decide between gray and white and just settles on both layered like someone draped a wet bedsheet over the whole city. Not cold enough for the coat I was wearing. Not warm enough to take it off. That perfect meteorological indifference London does better than anywhere on earth. Whitehall was already filling with the day's first real drift of tourists, couples with matching walking shoes, a school group from somewhere in Germany whose teacher was losing a visible battle with a clipboard, and 31 14-year-olds, a man selling umbrellas from a cart, even though it wasn't raining yet, positioned there in pure confidence that it would be. I almost walked past. I don't know what made me stop. Probably the horse, honestly. I'm not going to pretend it was some deep gravitational pull toward history or pageantry. The horse was enormous and black and standing so perfectly still that my brain registered it as wrong before it registered it as real. Animals don't do that. Animals shift, fidget, flick their ears at flies, redistribute their weight from hoof to hoof. This horse was doing none of those things. Then, I looked up at the rider. He was in full mounted sentry uniform. The whole extraordinary thing. Gleaming breastplate catching what gray light existed and throwing it back polished. The helmet with the white plume that should have looked absurd and somehow absolutely did not. Dark riding boots. White gauntlets, so bright they looked like they'd been lacquered rather than laundered. And beneath the visor of that helmet, a face as still as the rest of him. Not blank. That's the word people use, and it's wrong. Blank is the face of someone who isn't thinking about anything. This was the face of someone thinking about exactly one thing, with the entire weight of their concentration directed at it, leaving nothing left over for expression. His eyes were forward, not scanning the crowd, not tracking movement, not doing what every human pair of eyes in that courtyard was doing, which was flicking, measuring, comparing, checking phones, looking at the guard, looking away, looking back. His eyes were just forward. I've tried to explain that to people afterward, and they nod like they understand, and I can tell they're picturing someone staring blankly into the middle distance. It wasn't that. It was closer to, you know how sometimes in a concert hall, just before the orchestra starts, someone will tap the music stand, and every musician will find their position, and there will be this one suspended second where the entire room is ready. It was that, permanently, like he'd found a position and just stayed in it. I stood there longer than I meant to. The school group swept around me, then past me. A woman in a yellow raincoat took 6 photographs in quick succession and moved on. A man with a selfie stick spent 45 seconds trying to get the horse in the right part of his frame and then left. The guard didn't move. I drifted to the low railing that runs along the front of the alcove, not close enough to touch anything, just closer, and I noticed that other people were starting to collect there too. Not a crowd yet. A loose gathering. The sort of thing that happens organically when one person stops, and the people behind them notice the stopping and slow down to see what's worth stopping for. There was a woman to my left. Mid-40s, I'd estimate. Well-dressed in a structured way that suggested she'd come from somewhere with a dress code she'd taken seriously. American accent when she spoke, which she did quietly to the man beside her, who I assumed was her husband. She was watching the guard with an expression that I can only describe as professionally evaluative. The way a judge watches a performance, measuring it against some internal standard. I wasn't paying her much attention. Not yet. It was a boy who changed the atmosphere. Maybe 8, 9 years old. Dark-haired, wearing a zip-up hoodie with some football club logo I didn't recognize, shoes that lit up when he walked, which he was doing at the kind of frantic half-running toddle that 8-year-olds do when they're excited and have not yet learned to perform composure for strangers. He burst through the edge of the gathered people and pressed himself against the railing with both hands, face tilted up at the guard, mouth slightly open. "Mum," he said, at a volume that suggested he believed he was whispering. "Mum, he's not moving." The mother, a tired-looking woman with a canvas shopping bag, and the particular expression of someone who has been managing another person's wonder all morning, caught up and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. He's a soldier. He stands guard. But he's not." The boy squinted. "Is he real?" "Yes, he's real. He doesn't look real." "He is." The boy stared. The guard did not acknowledge this exchange in any way that was visible to human perception. "Can I talk to him?" "You can say hello." The boy thought about this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. Then he squared his shoulders, genuinely squared them, the way kids do when they're trying to be brave, and said loudly and clearly, "Hello." Nothing. Not a flicker. Not a breath that anyone could detect. The white plume didn't sway. The horse's ear twitched once, and that was all. The boy looked back at his mother, delighted and horrified in equal measure. He didn't say hello back. "He can't, sweetheart. He's on duty." "That's rude." The mother started to explain something about duty and protocol, and this is his job. And the boy listened with the skeptical frown of someone who has not yet decided whether they accept the rules of a world they didn't design. I was smiling. Most of the people nearby were smiling. It was the kind of small human moment that makes strangers briefly a community, everyone sharing the same gentle amusement, everyone appreciating the boy's logic, everyone understanding the guard's position without needing it explained. The woman in the structured coat was not smiling. She was watching the guard, and her expression had shifted into something that made me pay attention. I can't tell you exactly when I first registered her properly. It was gradual, the way you notice a change in weather. Not the moment it changes, but the moment the change has already happened and you realize you've been feeling it for a while. She'd moved a step closer to the railing. Her posture had changed. Where before she'd been standing with the loose observation of a tourist, she was now carrying herself with a different kind of intention. Something angular in her jaw. Her eyes had narrowed. She was watching the guard the way you watch someone who has offended you. The man beside her, her husband, I decided, was looking at his phone, checking something, unaware. She leaned toward him and said something close to his ear. He looked up, followed her gaze toward the guard, then back at her, with the expression of someone who has heard a surprising interpretation of a situation and isn't sure yet whether to accept it. She said something else. He made a small, doubtful sound. Not agreement, not disagreement. The diplomatic non-sound of a man who has learned to be careful. She turned back to the guard. Her arms crossed. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters. She was not making a scene. She was not loud, not confrontational in any outward way. She was doing something quieter and, in its own way, more charged. She was deciding something. You could see it happen. The way a weather system decides what it's going to do and then commits. She stepped forward along the railing until she was more or less directly in front of the guard. She looked up at him. He looked forward. She waited. He did not look at her. And something in her face went very still, in the way that faces go still when something expected fails to happen and the person is recalibrating. Not embarrassment. Not confusion. Something harder. She turned back to her husband. "He's ignoring me," she said. And this time I heard it clearly, because she hadn't modulated her voice for a private conversation. "He literally will not look at me." The husband looked at the guard, looked at her, made the diplomatic sound again. "He's not ignoring you," he said. "He's on duty. He can't. I'm standing right here." "I know, but I walked up to him. I'm standing right here looking at him, and he will not. She made a small, sharp gesture toward the guard. Is this what they trained him to do? Just pretend people don't exist. Yeah. Actually, yeah. That's kind of exactly what they trained them. That's incredibly rude. And there it was. Not shouted. Not performed for anyone's benefit. She meant it. That was the thing that made the back of my neck do something. She genuinely, in that moment, believed that the guard was being rude to her personally. She was not a stupid woman. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy to construct this story around her being foolish or entitled or culturally ignorant, and that would be the comfortable version, the version that lets everyone else off the hook. She wasn't any of those things. She was a person who had walked up to another person, stood in front of him, and been met with an absence of acknowledgement so total that it had triggered, in her, the same response any of us would have if we spoke to someone, and they refused to look at us. The instinct is ancient. It's in the body before it's in the mind. Being unseen, deliberately, that's a kind of erasure. It communicates something. In normal life, in any normal encounter, it means, you are beneath my attention. You do not register. You are not worth turning my eyes toward. She knew, intellectually, that this was a soldier on ceremonial duty. But her body had already filed its report, and her body was offended. Her husband was talking, quietly, hands slightly raised in the universal posture of gentle reasoning, but she wasn't fully receiving it. She was still looking at the guard. The guard was looking forward. The white plume did not move. The horse was still, and something was beginning to shift in the atmosphere of the small, gathered crowd. The smiling had stopped. People were watching the woman now, not the guard. That particular crowd alertness that happens when a social situation becomes uncertain, when a script is changed and no one knows the new one yet. The boy with the light-up shoes had gone quiet. His mother was watching the woman with an expression that had moved from mild interest to something more careful. I realized I was holding my railing a little tighter than I had been. Here is something I didn't know until that morning, or didn't know properly, which is different from not knowing. Stillness is not passive. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something you'd read on a motivational graphic over a mountain range. But, I mean in a purely physical, observable sense. The mounted sentry at horse guards, that specific job, that specific uniform, that specific level of immobility, is not the absence of effort. It is effort compressed to its most invisible form. It is the kind of discipline that looks like nothing because everything has been poured into it. I thought about this while the woman's husband was talking to her. I thought about what it actually cost to not move. Not just to stand still. That's easy. That's what you do waiting for a bus. I mean to not move in the way that he wasn't moving. In the presence of a crowd of strangers who were all looking at you. Some of them photographing you. One of them apparently taking personal offense at your professionalism. The boy with the light-up shoes having recently and loudly judged your manners. The October air carrying a dozen conversations in a dozen languages. The sound of traffic from the Strand. A pigeon somewhere being a pigeon. And to keep your eyes forward. To keep your hands still on the reins. To present to the world a surface as undisturbed as water in a covered well. That is work. That is serious, sustained, costly work. And the woman in the structured coat was calling it rude. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that. I stood there at the railing, and I watched, and I didn't open my mouth, partly because it wasn't my business, and partly because I didn't know how to explain what I was thinking in a way that would land without sounding patronizing. So I watched. The shift, when it came, started with a sound. Not dramatic, nothing like a shout or a crash. A low, mechanical clopping that you heard a half-second before you placed it, and then the mounted sentry on the far side of the building, the other alcove, the other guard, the partner who'd been standing at his own post with his own version of that complete and compacted stillness, moved. Just a fraction. A slight adjustment of his horse, a repositioning, something that must have been sanctioned or routine. People turned to look. The woman turned to look. And in that 2-second window, while heads had rotated away from the near guard, the one she'd been fixed on, I happened to be one of the only people still facing him. So I was one of the only people who saw it. His jaw moved. It was the smallest thing in the world. The tiniest possible contraction of muscle along the line of his jaw, beneath the visor edge. Not a smile, not a grimace. Something far more contained than either, a kind of minute adjustment, the kind your face makes when you're keeping a long, professional hold on something, and the something tugs just slightly at its chain. He was human. Of course he was human. But in that second, having watched him be so comprehensively still for so long, the tiny movement hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. Because what it told me was not that he was relaxing. What it told me was that the stillness was not easy. That he'd been holding something, had been holding it since before I arrived, and would go on holding it after I left, and this was the first evidence I'd seen that holding it required anything at all. The crowd turned back. He was still again. If anyone else had seen it, they gave no sign. The husband had apparently made some progress. The woman's arms had uncrossed. She wasn't fully convinced. You could see that in the set of her shoulders, which had the quality of someone who has accepted a partial explanation and is reserving the right to review their position later. But the active, directed offense seemed to have subsided into something more pensive. She was still looking at the guard, but differently. The measurement in her eyes had shifted from judgment to something closer to study. "I just don't understand," she said. Not to her husband specifically. Not to anyone. How do they do it? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The question was real, but it wasn't looking for information. It was the thing you say when something has genuinely surprised you about the world, when a thing you thought you understood has revealed a dimension you didn't account for. How do they do it? The boy with the light-up shoes had inched back toward the railing. His mother wasn't pulling him away this time. She was watching the guard, too, in that new, quieter way that had settled over the small crowd. "Mum," the boy said, at a slightly lower volume than before. "Is he allowed to blink?" "I think so, yes. I haven't seen him blink. That doesn't mean he doesn't." The boy considered this with visible philosophical effort. What if a fly lands on him? Then he deals with it later. What if it goes in his eye? The mother pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was suppressing something. Then, I imagine he's had worse. There was a man I hadn't noticed before, now standing a few feet to my right. He'd materialized the way some people do in crowd situations. No dramatic arrival, just suddenly present, as if he'd been assembled from the ambient tourist population. Older than me by at least 20 years. Gray wool coat. The kind of leather, shoes you only own if you've kept them for decades, and had them resold. He had a guidebook, but closed, tucked under his arm. Not consulting it, just carrying it. He was watching the guard with an expression I recognized from somewhere and couldn't immediately place. Then I placed it. It was the expression of someone who knows something. Not superiority, not condescension. That specific quality of face that comes when a person is watching something they have a personal relationship with. Like how people look at hometowns when they return after years away. Recognition layered over all the things you can't say aloud. He noticed me looking at him. He gave a small nod toward the guard. "You know what the horse weighs?" he said, conversationally. Not loud, just to me or to the air between us. "No," I said. "About 500 kilograms. Thereabouts." He tilted his head slightly. "And the rider is on him, fully kit, for 2 hours. Both of them. Standing." I looked at the horse. The horse remained indifferent to being discussed. 2 hours, I said. 2 hours. No water for the horse. No break for either of them, whatever the weather. He glanced at the sky in a way that communicated he had cataloged the various weathers this particular courtyard could produce and had found none of them comfortable. "There's a barracks behind the building. After the shift, both of them rest." He paused. "They've earned it." "Were you?" I started. "Long time ago," he said, in a way that closed the question gently but completely. He looked back at the guard. "The thing people always get wrong," he said, after a moment, "is they think the stillness means he's not here. Not present. Switched off." He shook his head. "Slightly. It's the opposite. You have to be more present, not less. Because if you let your attention wander, really wander, go somewhere else in your head, that's when you drift. That's when the horse feels it in your leg. That's when your posture drops half a centimeter. That's when you scratch your nose." I looked at the guard's hands. White gauntlets, perfectly still on the reins. The attention is the discipline, the man said. The stillness is just what it looks like from the outside. The woman had heard him. I don't think he'd intended to be her beyond me, but she was close enough, and she had the kind of hearing that comes from being an attentive person, and her head had turned slightly in that way heads turn when a sound registers as information. She looked at the older man. "Did you serve?" she asked. "Directly. No preambid." He turned toward her with the ease of a person who doesn't find directness startling. "Different regiment," he said. "Different era. But yes." She looked back at the guard. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. Not embarrassment. More like a recalibration. The expression of a person who has been handed a piece of information that changes the geometry of something they'd already drawn a map of. "I thought," she started, then stopped. "You thought he was ignoring you," the man said. Not unkindly, just factually. She turned to him with an expression that could have been defensive and chose not to be. "Yes," she said. "Most people think that." He said it in the same factual way. Not most stupid people. Not it's understandable, but just most people. A neutral observation. It's the face and the eyes. The training makes it look like indifference because indifference and total concentration look identical from the outside if you're not the one doing it. "But he knows I'm here. Every person within 20 meters, the man said. He knows. He couldn't do the job if he didn't." She was quiet for a moment. She paused again. Chose her next word with care. "That's stranger than I expected." "Yes," the man said. "It is." The horse moved. Not dramatically. Not the horse bolting or rearing or any of the things horses do in dramatic stories. Just the subtle redistribution of weight that a standing animal makes to prevent muscle fatigue, a small shift from one side to the other, entirely calm, entirely controlled. The guard accommodated it without visible effort. His body adjusted the way a boat adjusts to a swell. The correction was there. You could see it happen if you were watching closely enough, and then it was done, and the stillness resumed. The boy with the light-up shoes grabbed his mother's hand. "He moved," he whispered. "Just the horse, sweetheart. But he fixed it. Did you see? He fixed it. I saw." The boy looked up at the guard with an expression I'm going to carry around for a while, I think. It was the expression of someone who has just had their model of a thing significantly revised. He'd come to this railing with a child's binary, real or not real, moving or not moving, here or not here. And the event of the horse shift had cracked that open into something more complex and more interesting. The guard hadn't moved. The guard had responded. These were the boy was working out different things. The woman's husband had put his phone away. At some point in the last few minutes, I couldn't have said exactly when, he'd stopped being the person who was diplomatically managing his wife's reaction and started being someone who was just watching. His hands were in his coat pockets. His face had the loose, unguarded quality it gets when you forget you're in public. "What's his name?" the woman asked the older man. "I don't know this particular soldier's name. But he has one. Of course. And somewhere, at home, or wherever, there's someone who knows him. His family. And they look at him the same way we do, and they know." She stopped. "Searched. They know what's under the uniform." The older man looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. Looked back at the guard. "I owe him an apology," she said. Quietly. More to herself than anyone. "He wouldn't accept it," the man said. "Not while he's on duty." "I know." She exhaled slowly. "I know that now." The October light shifted. Somewhere over the Thames, the clouds had reshuffled themselves, and a clean white light pressed through for a moment, brief and decisive, landing across the courtyard and catching the breastplate and turning it from polished gray to something approaching silver. The white plume glowed. The guard stood in it like he'd stood in every light this courtyard had ever produced. The boy let go of his mother's hand and pressed both palms flat against the railing, looking up. "He's like a statue," he said, "but better." His mother looked down at him. "What do you mean better?" The boy thought about it carefully. "Because statues don't choose to." The old man in the gray wool coat left before the shift change. He didn't announce it. Didn't say goodbye, not formally. He gave me one last look, a brief, precise thing, like a full stop at the end of a paragraph, and then moved off through the courtyard the way he'd materialized gradually and without drama, absorbed back into the city's ordinary fabric. I watched him go. Then, I turned back to the guard. The crowd had evolved over the previous hour into something different from what it had been when I arrived. It was still, technically, a group of strangers, but strangers who had now shared a thing. That wordless, accumulated shared experience of watching the woman's initial offense, of the old man's explanation, of the boy's running commentary, of the horse's shift, and the guard's wordless correction. People don't always register these small shared witnesses as events, but they are. They change the air in a group. They create a very temporary and very real kind of community, the kind that exists only in a specific place on a specific morning and will never reassemble in quite this configuration again. The German school group had long since moved on. A new wave of tourists had arrived. Japanese, from the matching tour group lanyards, cameras in systematic use, a guide speaking into a small speaker clipped to her collar. They circled the courtyard efficiently and photographed everything and moved on. The woman and her husband had not moved. She was still at the railing, not agitated anymore. The arms were uncrossed, the jaw had relaxed, but present in that specific way of someone who has decided, consciously or otherwise, to stay until something happens or until the staying itself means something. Her husband was standing close enough that their shoulders were touching. He'd found, at some point, a coffee from somewhere. One of those paper cups that materialize in British city centers the way street pigeons do without obvious origin, and was holding it in both hands, warming his palms. He offered her a sip. She took it, not looking away from the guard. There was so much marriage in that small sequence of movements that I had to look away for a second. I've been trying to work out, since that morning, what it was about the guard that kept people there. Not the novelty. Novelty burns off fast, especially in a city like London that is essentially assembled from things designed to produce novelty. The changing of the guard at Buckingham pulls its crowds on spectacle. The movement, the music, the synchronized choreography, the whole theatrical production of it. That's a different thing entirely. The horse guard sentry is the opposite of spectacle. He is the deliberate refusal of spectacle. He is a man choosing, through trained discipline and sustained effort, to give you nothing. No acknowledgement, no performance, no return on your attention. He offers only his presence. And in offering only that, he creates something strange, a kind of negative space, a human shape with a human responsiveness removed, and your eyes and your brain keep reaching toward it, and keep finding nothing, and keep being surprised by the nothing, and somehow can't stop reaching. It is, if you stay long enough, profound. Not in a theatrical way. In a quiet, persistent, slightly uncomfortable way, the way real profundity tends to be, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't wrap up neatly and leave you sitting with a question you can't quite fully form. The boy had gotten closer to it than any of the adults. Statues don't choose to. He was 12 minutes from the end of his shift when the incident happened. Not an incident like a crisis. Not the kind of incident that makes it into accounts of exceptional military conduct or breaks into the news cycle. Just an incident. The kind that happens in crowds, in cities, on ordinary Tuesday mornings in October, and means nothing and means everything depending on where you're standing. A man walked up to the railing. Late 20s. Tracksuit, the expensive kind that announces itself through cut rather than logo. Confidence that carried itself slightly ahead of him, like a bow wave. He had his phone already raised, already filming, and he was narrating something into the camera in a low, performing voice, the voice of someone who is always being watched, or at least always rehearsing for it. He stepped up to the railing. He looked at the guard. The guard looked forward. The man leaned closer. His phone was aimed at the guard's face, maybe 18 inches away. He said something. I couldn't hear it from where I stood, but the shape of it in his body was performative. A provocation designed to land on camera. The guard's eyes didn't move. The man said something else. Louder. A few people turned to look. The guard's jaw didn't move. The man, apparently deciding he needed a stronger provocation for his footage, reached over the railing. He didn't touch the horse. I want to be clear. He didn't touch the horse. but he extended his hand toward the horse's bridle, and the gesture was unmistakable. I could touch this if I wanted to. Watch me almost touch this. The horse's ear went back. That was all. One ear, rotating backward on its hinge like a small radar dish, reorienting. But then the guard spoke. I will try to be precise about this, because the precision matters. He did not shout. He did not break position. His eyes stayed forward. His body stayed in its architecture of trained stillness. But from within that stillness, from behind the visor and the immobility and the 2 hours of compacted silence, his voice came out. Loud, clear, and of a quality that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not heard a soldier give a command. It wasn't angry. That's what surprised people. It wasn't the voice of a man pushed past patience. It was the voice of authority delivered from an entirely calm place. The kind of voice that emerges when a person has no doubt whatsoever about their right to make a demand and no uncertainty whatsoever about whether it will be obeyed. Step back from the horse. 3 words. The 4th was there in the tone. Now. The man with the phone stepped back. Not dramatically. Not with argument or bluster or any of the things you might expect from someone who had been performing confidence for a camera 30 seconds earlier. He just stepped back. His body did it before his mind had, apparently, fully processed the order. The reaction was almost reflexive. The voice had issued a command, and his legs had executed it. And then the rest of him caught up and stood there holding its phone and recalibrating. The crowd, which had gone very still in the 2 seconds after the command, released something. A collective breath. A very small, dispersed sound, the acoustic equivalent of everyone unclenching their shoulders simultaneously. The boy said, "Whoa," at a volume that was not quite a whisper. His mother put a hand on his back. The man with the phone looked at the guard for a moment. The guard was already back, not that he'd ever visibly left, in his full, unbroken, forward-facing stillness, as if the command had not happened. As if the voice had emerged from some separate instrument and then returned to silence without disturbing the instrument's surface. The man looked at his phone. Then he left. Quickly, not running, but briskly, with the purposeful stride of someone who has decided they were done here before they quite planned to be. The woman let out a long, slow breath. "My God," she said. Not to anyone. Not a performance. Just the sound of something landing. Her husband looked at her. "Now you see," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "He knew," she said. "All along, the whole time I was standing there. He knew exactly." She stopped. Started again. "He wasn't ignoring me. He was choosing. There's a difference." "There's a big difference," her husband said. She turned back to the guard, and what was in her face now I would not call admiration. Exactly. Admiration is a little too clean, a little too resolved. It was something more unfinished than that. Something that was still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. "I feel like I should apologize," she said again. "You said that before." "I know." She paused. "I still feel it." The husband put his arm around her. The guard stood in his alcove and looked forward. The shift change happened at 11 o'clock. I know this because the boy announced it. "Something's happening, Mum. Something's happening," about 3 minutes before it did, when the sound of hooves on stone began from inside the building, a slow, ceremonial rhythm, and the crowd that had accumulated reformed itself along the railing with a collective leaning forward. The relief rider came out from the archway on a horse almost identical to the sentry's, dark, enormous, moving with the controlled power of something that could also, if it chose, destroy half the railing in 10 seconds, and has been trained to know it has other options. The outgoing sentry moved for the first time. Not just a micro-adjustment of the jaw. Not just the accommodation of the horse's shift. He moved. He turned. He rode out from his alcove in a slow, deliberate arc that brought him alongside the relief. And there was a brief exchange, precise, wordless as far as I could tell from the railing, ritual in its economy. And then the outgoing sentry rode back through the archgon. The new sentry took position. The new sentry looked forward. The crowd stayed for another few minutes, as if the transition needed to fully settle before people felt they'd seen something complete. Then it dispersed the way dispersals happen. One person peeling off, then another, then a cluster, then the remainder, realizing the remainder has dwindled enough to make staying feel strange. The boy left with his mother. He stopped right before the courtyard turned into the pedestrian walkway. He turned back and looked at the new century, the same position, the same stillness, different person, and he stood there for a second that was longer than you'd expect from an 8-year-old who's been patient longer than most 8-year-olds ever are. Then he raised his hand, not a full wave, a small, specific gesture, fingers up, palm out, the kind of salute that children make when they're serious about it and know they're inventing a version of something they've seen but don't quite have the vocabulary for yet. He held it there for a moment. The new century, of course, didn't look at him. Didn't have to. The boy turned and took his mother's hand and walked away, and his shoes lit up blue and orange with each step, and the ordinary city swallowed them up as cities do, efficiently, completely, without ceremony. I found a cafe on Whitehall, the kind of place that exists for the people who work in the surrounding offices, and has therefore never felt any commercial pressure to be charming. Laminate tables, a chalkboard with the day's specials written in a handwriting that gave the impression of effort rather than talent. Tea in a mug with a small chip in the handle that someone had marked with a piece of blue tape, apparently so it could be pulled from service eventually, and had instead just lived there, chipped and taped for what looked like a significant portion of the current decade. I sat there for 40 minutes. I ordered a tea and then a second tea and a piece of shortbread that arrived wrapped in a small square of greaseproof paper and was honestly quite good. I thought about the guard. Not the man. I didn't know the man. I didn't know his name or where he'd grown up or what his voice sounded like when it wasn't delivering a command or whether he liked football or hated it or what he thought about during those 2 hours of compacted stillness when the whole world was watching and he was giving it nothing back. I thought about the thing he was doing, the shape of it, the cost of it. There are a lot of ways to be seen. Most of them involve giving something, a performance, an expression, a response, a reaction. You give something, and the people watching receive something, and the transaction of being witnessed is complete. You exist in relation to the attention directed at you. He had found a different way. He stood there and gave nothing and asked for nothing, and the people watching received. And this is the part one kept turning over in my head in the cafe with the chip mug and the quite good shortbread. They received something anyway. Not from him, exactly. From the encounter with his refusal. From their own reflection off his stillness. From the confusion the woman had felt, and the boy's pure logical puzzlement, and the older man's quiet pride, and the cold October light on the silver breastplate, and the horse's single ear rotating backward like a warning and a grace note simultaneously. He gave nothing. We made something from it. My flight was delayed a further 3 hours. I spent them back at the airport in one of those strange, time-resistant terminal zones where every surface is optimized for transients and nothing feels quite real. I got a sandwich from a chain that has exactly the same sandwich in every airport in every country and has presumably resolved its feelings about that. I read half an article about something I can't now remember. I watched a family across from me. 3 children, 2 adults, 1 grandmother, luggage tower of impressive engineering, manage the chaos of an airport with the weary competence of people who have done this before and will do it again. At some point, I got out my phone and I wrote down badly and in fragments what had happened that morning. Not the facts of it. The facts of it are simple. They barely merit the time it takes to list them. A man stood guard. A woman mistook his discipline for disrespect. The mistake led to a small understanding. An 8-year-old said something true about statues. A shift changed. What I wrote down was what I was still working out about it. About the woman's instinct, which was not wrong. Exactly. Which was the perfectly human response to an experience of being unseen, arriving from a body that had been wired by millions of years of social evolution to treat being ignored by another person as a meaningful and threatening signal. She wasn't foolish. She was human. The thing she'd walked into was something that looked like a human interaction and produced none of the outputs of one. About the old man. About how little he'd said and how much it had conveyed. about how he'd said most people think that with no judgment, as if this were just an observable phenomenon in the world, like the way light bends at the edge of a lens, and the only appropriate response to it was quiet, clear information. About the boy, statues don't choose to. I kept coming back to that, because it was true in ways the boy wasn't equipped yet to know. It was true in the most ordinary sense. A statue has no choice. The guard is making one, constantly, every second, but it was also true in the way that things are true when they're also about something else, when a true thing is sitting on top of another true thing and pointing at it without knowing that's what it's doing. Every act of sustained discipline is a choice. Not once. Not at the beginning, when you sign up, when you take the oath, when you put on the uniform for the first time, and feel whatever you feel in that first moment. Every second of it is a choice. Every time the crowd gets close and noisy, every time someone thrusts a phone in your face, every time someone takes personal offense at your professional impassivity, the choice is made again. Stand. Look forward. Hold. That's not absence. That is presence of a very specific and very demanding kind. The woman was probably on her way to the next thing by then. A museum, a restaurant, the journey back to wherever she'd come from. I wondered whether she thought about it, whether she'd said anything more about it to her husband over dinner, whether in a week or a month or years from now, some moment of unjust slight, some encounter where she was genuinely unseen and genuinely disrespected. She'd find herself thinking of this morning and understanding more precisely what the difference felt like. I hope so. Not in a way that required anything from her. Just the quiet hope that the morning had gone somewhere useful in her, the way mornings like that sometimes do. The boy would remember it. Of that I was certain. Not the details. Not necessarily the courtyard or the uniform or the white plume. But the feeling. The boy who invented his own small salute on the way out. The hand raised to someone who couldn't look back at him. The held gesture, the letting go. He'd carry that for a long time, in one form or another. My flight boarded at 4:47 p.m. I found my seat, put my bag in the overhead bin, sat down, looked out the oval window at the gray British sky doing its thing, and I thought about one more piece of it that I hadn't quite finished yet. The guard had spent 2 hours being looked at without being seen, and I had spent 2 hours looking at him without, until close to the end, fully seeing him. We'd both been present. We'd both been doing the work of being there. And the gap between those two things, between presence and being perceived, between standing in a place and being understood in it, is possibly the loneliest distance in the world. He'd trained for it. He'd chosen it. He carried it daily with discipline and deliberateness, and what came across from the outside was simply a man who wouldn't look at you. I thought about all the people in the world who were standing still and being mistaken for indifferent, who are holding something at enormous cost and having the holding read as absence, whose discipline or grief or restraint or simply their particular kind of silence is processed by everyone around them as disrespect or coldness or nothing. And how rarely anyone stays long enough to understand what the stillness actually costs. We lifted off just before 5. The city dropped away below us, the Thames cutting its silver path through it, the parks going rust and amber at their edges, the whole vast, compressed, improbable thing of London pulling back into a pattern you can't see when you're inside it. I pressed my forehead briefly against the cold of the window. Somewhere down there, in a courtyard on Whitehall, a mounted sentry was standing at the beginning of his shift, looking forward, giving nothing, holding everything, and probably at the railing someone was watching him, deciding, because his eyes didn't move when they approached, because his face offered no return on their attention, because he looked at the middle distance with a completeness that felt like deliberate erasure, deciding that he was being rude. They would stand there for a while, feeling that, and then, if they were lucky, if an old man appeared or a boy with light-up shoes, or just time, just the sheer accumulated time of watching, they would begin to see it differently. Not all of them, but some. And some is how understanding moves through the world, one small morning at a time, one railing, one choosing to hold still while everyone around you mistakes it for not caring at all.